Reporting on the war in Ukraine is increasingly focusing on the trade-offs for Russian and Ukrainian forces as they conduct and respond to the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast and Russian offensive efforts in eastern Ukraine. There are various assertions about the significance of both operations, but assessing the operational significance of the Kursk incursion and the Russian offensive operation in eastern Ukraine requires zooming out a bit. My name is Riley Bailey, and I'm a Russian analyst at the Institute for the Study of War. Let's discuss a balanced framework for assessing the significance of the current Russian and Ukrainian operations for the course of the war. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast and Russian offensive operations in eastern Ukraine are not in themselves decisive military operations that will win the war. Both Russian and Ukrainian forces lack the capability to conduct individual, decisive war-winning operations and must instead conduct multiple successive operations with limited operational objectives that are far short of victory, but that in aggregate can achieve strategic objectives. It is too early to assess the outcomes and operational significance of the Ukrainian incursion into Russia and the ongoing Russian offensive effort in eastern Ukraine. The significance of these operations will not emerge in isolation, moreover, but they will matter insofar as they relate to a series of subsequent Russian and Ukrainian campaigns over time. The scale of the war in Ukraine prevents either side from resolving the war in a single decisive campaign. Russia and Ukraine's ability to generate enough combat power to man continuous defensive positions with no open flanks and establish tactical depth at significant points along the front line has forced both sides to attempt costly penetration battles. Russia and Ukraine can usually establish defensive positions at some distance in the rear and sufficiently stabilize the front line, even in the event of a successful penetration and exploitation. Effective Ukrainian and Russian campaign design therefore requires planning for multiple successive operations that each set conditions for the subsequent operation. Rarely has either side been able to conduct successive operations without interruption, however, since operational pauses or decreased operational tempo have offered the other belligerent the opportunity to contest and seize the initiative. Ongoing Russian and Ukrainian operations are closely tied to efforts to retain or contest the battlefield initiative and the theater-wide initiative. Russian President Vladimir Putin views maintaining the theater-wide initiative as a strategic imperative to win a war of attrition against Ukraine. Russian forces seized the theater-wide initiative in November 2023 and have since conducted consistent offensive operations throughout eastern Ukraine as part of a campaign designed to stretch Ukrainian forces and prevent Ukraine from accumulating the resources necessary to contest the initiative. Putin likely assesses that as long as Russia can retain the initiative and prevent Ukraine from conducting operationally significant counteroffensive operations, Russia can inflict decisive losses on Ukraine over the long term, while outlasting Western security assistance to Ukraine and Ukrainian efforts to mobilize more of Ukraine's economy and population for the war effort. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast has temporarily allowed Ukrainian forces to seize the battlefield initiative on one sector of the front line and begin contesting Russia's theater-wide initiative. The Russian military appears to be attempting to maintain its offensive pressure in Donetsk Oblast, specifically its offensive operation to seize Pokrovsk, and likely hopes that sustained offensive tempo in Donetsk Oblast will draw significant Ukrainian resources to defensive operations in the area. Just because Russian forces are prioritizing the offensive operation on Pokrovsk does not mean that Ukraine must decide to prioritize the defense of Pokrovsk over efforts elsewhere. Ukrainian officials have indicated that Ukraine's operation in Kursk Oblast does not have long-term territorial objectives, but instead aims to generate theater-wide operational and strategic pressures on Russian forces. The success of the Ukrainian incursion should thus not be evaluated in terms of Russian territory seized by Ukrainian forces. The Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast has prompted the Russian military to redeploy forces throughout the theater to the front line in Kursk Oblast, and subsequent phases of fighting within Russia will likely generate even greater pressures on Russia. The redeployment of Russian forces and the commitment of elements of operational reserves has allowed Russian forces to slow initially rapid Ukrainian gains in Kursk Oblast and start containing the extent of the Ukrainian incursion. Containment is only the first and likely least resource-intensive phase of the Russian response in Kursk Oblast, however. A Russian counteroffensive operation to retake territory seized by Ukrainian forces in Kursk Oblast will very likely require even more manpower, equipment, and materiel. For example, Russian forces have expended considerable combat power on the effort to seize Pokrovsk, which they began in mid-February 2024 after seizing Avdiivka, and have since advanced roughly 23 kilometers in the area over 6 months of the most intense fighting in Ukraine in 2024. The current Ukrainian salient in Kursk Oblast appears to be roughly 56 kilometers wide and up to 28 kilometers deep, although the area where Ukrainian forces are consolidating positions is likely smaller in size. Russian forces will likely have to conduct a prolonged counteroffensive effort to retake all of the territory seized by Ukrainian forces in Kursk Oblast, unless they bring overwhelming force to bear, and the Russian military command will likely have to commit additional operational reserves and newly generated forces to sustain the effort. The Ukrainian operation in Kursk Oblast has also forced a decision point on Putin about the long-term strategic requirements of defending the 1,000-kilometer-long international border with northeastern Ukraine, and it's unlikely that Russia will conduct intensive counteroffensive operations to push Ukrainian forces back across the border, only to once again leave it vulnerable to future Ukrainian incursions. Putin will likely order the Russian military command to consider the manpower and materiel requirements for defending the international border, although it's unclear how he will weigh these requirements against Russian military requirements in Ukraine. Russian forces will not be able to retain the initiative throughout eastern Ukraine indefinitely, and the culmination of Russian offensive operations will present Ukrainian forces with opportunities to contest the initiative further. Russian possession of the theater-wide initiative has allowed Russia to determine the location, time, intensity, and requirements of fighting in Ukraine, and Russian forces have leveraged these benefits to determine an offensive tempo in Ukraine that has allowed the Russian military to conduct more sustainable offensive efforts and largely avoid a culmination. Russian forces pursued a prolonged effort to establish strategic and operational reserves to support ongoing offensive efforts this summer, and the Russian military has likely expended and committed many of these reserves to offensive operations throughout eastern and northeastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian incursion in Kursk Oblast and the heightened Russian priority for maintaining the tempo of offensive operations in Donetsk Oblast will likely place greater strain on Russia's remaining operational reserves and likely begin to impact Russia's ability to sustain consistent offensive operations throughout the theater. Further Russian redeployments to Kursk Oblast would also further weaken Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations in northeastern and eastern Ukraine, although Russian forces are more likely to begin decreasing offensive activity on lower priority sectors of the front first. Russia's prioritized effort to seize Pokrovsk and Donetsk Oblast and Ukraine's incursion into Russia represent two very different approaches to warfare. The Russian offensive operation to seize Pokrovsk is emblematic of the Russian approach to the war in Ukraine that embraces positional warfare for gradual creeping advances. The Russian military command has tolerated significant manpower losses in exchange for advancing roughly 2 square kilometers per day in Pokrovsk Raion over the last 6 months. Russian forces in the Pokrovsk direction have focused on frontal infantry assaults from small village to small village in their gradual advance to Pokrovsk, and have spent weeks at times trying to seize small villages in the area without attempting advance by maneuver. This approach overwhelmingly relies on Russia's manpower and materiel advantage, and assumes that Ukrainian forces cannot acquire and sustain the manpower and materiel required to prevent indefinite, gradual Russian advances or contest the initiative. Ukrainian forces appear to be actively challenging this assumption in Kursk Oblast. Ukraine's incursion into Kursk Oblast illustrates how Ukrainian forces can use maneuver warfare to offset Russian manpower and materiel advantages. Russian forces have overall occupied 1,175 square kilometers of territory throughout the entire Ukrainian theater in 2024 as of July. In stark contrast, ISW has observed claims that Ukraine's operation in Kursk Oblast advanced roughly 800 square kilometers over 6 days from August 6th to 12th. The initial Ukrainian incursion into Kursk Oblast attacked largely unprepared, unequipped, and unmanned Russian defensive positions along the border. But Ukraine has continued to leverage maneuver to make rapid advances in Kursk Oblast following the deployment of Russian reinforcements to the area. Ukraine's use of maneuver in Kursk Oblast serves as an example of how Ukrainian maneuver, coupled with operational surprise, can result in comparably sized gains in significantly shorter periods of time with less manpower and materiel. Prolonged positional warfare, in contrast, will only make Ukraine's resource disadvantages more pronounced, and protracted war will increase the cost to Ukraine and its partners. It is too early to draw dispositive conclusions about the lasting effects that the two very different Russian and Ukrainian efforts will have. ISW will continue to refrain from commenting on Ukrainian operational intent in Kursk Oblast or elsewhere in the theater beyond what Ukrainian officials themselves have said in order to protect Ukrainian operational security. But it is safe to conclude that the operational significance of the incursion in Kursk Oblast will depend on how Ukrainian forces leverage the theater-wide pressures the operation has created in subsequent operations that pursue operationally significant objectives. ISW also considers assessments about the operational significance of the possible Russian seizure of Pokrovsk to be premature, given the possibility that Russian offensive operations throughout Donetsk Oblast will culminate in the coming weeks and months at yet-to-be-determined positions. The operational significance of Pokrovsk will likely depend on Russia's ability to leverage the seizure of the city and wider maneuver in Donetsk Oblast, which will be extremely difficult for Russian forces if offensive operations elsewhere in Donetsk Oblast culminate and in the absence of large operational reserves. It also remains unclear if Russian forces will be able to seize Pokrovsk before Russian forces culminate on this sector of the threat. Thank you for listening. For more updates on the war in Ukraine, please follow ISW.